Trump's threats and statehood taunts reset race to lead Canada. For over a year, Canada's Conservative Party seemed on track to win a decisive victory in the next election as Justin Trudeau's governing coalition crumbled. Now, nothing seems guaranteed, and the reason is Donald Trump. The national mood has changed and with it the landscape for this year's vote. Trudeau's Liberal Party is making gains in public opinion surveys, even though its members haven't chosen his successor yet. The race to become Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is increasingly looking like a two-way battle between former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland and former Central Bank Governor Mark Carney. Polls by Nano's research group and Leger Marketing show the Conservatives leading the Liberals by 8 or 9 points. A significant change from previous polls that showed as many as 27 points. A separate poll released by Abacus Data showed the Conservatives with a much wider advantage, but also found that voters most worried about Trump tended to believe the Liberals would be best at handling him. The US president has shocked Canada with threats to use economic force, including tariffs, as a strategy to coerce the country into becoming a US state. Trump's repeated taunts have upended decades of assumptions about national security and created seething resentment across Canada, realigning the country's politics in the process. Canadians' anger with Trump isn't just about trade. Regardless of how the tariffs pan out, the damage to the US-Canada relationship could last a generation. At a historic government building known as the West Block, Justin Trudeau took to a podium set up in front of 4 Canadian flags. People had waited for hours to hear how he planned to respond to US President Donald Trump's speech at Mar-a-Lago. Trudeau did something unusual. He started talking about war and history, saying he wanted to speak directly to Americans. He quoted John F. Kennedy, reminded people that Canada helped rescue American hostages in Iran in 1979 and talked about the Canadian soldiers left for dead in Afghanistan after 9/11. From the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of the Korean Peninsula, from the fields of Flanders to the streets of Kandahar, we fought and died with you, he said. But the Prime Minister's primary audience isn't American TV viewers. By invoking Canada's military past, Trudeau is also trying to achieve something he has struggled to do as his political capital has waned over the past few years. He's trying to appeal to Canadians' patriotism and unity while also tapping into their anger at Trump's decision to scrap the two countries' trade deal. He wants them to feel proud and angry at the same time. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre built his profile by relentlessly targeting Trudeau as the culprit for Canadians' affordability struggles, using slogans like "Axe the tax," a criticism of the Prime Minister's unpopular carbon tax. Now that Trudeau is leaving and Canadians face an alarming threat from their southern neighbor, the Conservatives are rebranding. Poilievre is planning a major speech Saturday with a nationalist motto, "Canada First," that mimics Trump's own. The Prime Minister's resignation marks the end of a political era and the beginning of a dramatic change in the nation's economy. While Justin Trudeau's resignation plunges Canada into political turmoil, at least one thing seems certain: an economy that's been buoyed by record immigration, increased government spending and green ambitions is poised for dramatic change. Now all of a sudden the enemy is not in Ottawa. The enemy is in Washington. It completely changes the political dynamic, said Sébastien Dallaire, executive vice president with polling firm Leger. It's much more difficult to keep using the same language as before, to keep talking about the same opponents as before, because that's not what Canadians want to hear right now. Gap between Liberals and Conservatives is closing. Poilievre's messages about domestic issues including inflation, housing, taxes and crime captured the popular mood. Trudeau's standing had been plummeting since 2023, but it was the accusation that he was ill-prepared for a trade war, made by Chrystia Freeland, his longtime finance minister, that finally finished him. Now, Freeland and Mark Carney, the former Bank of Canada and Bank of England governor, are the front-runners to replace him. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland has resigned from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's cabinet over disagreements over how to prepare for the Trump administration. A political earthquake that has shaken the Canadian government to its core. I think Trudeau's reputation and his popularity was so low that anybody else is going to see an increase in the polls, said Lisa Raitt, a former Conservative cabinet minister. The Liberals who said that they could never vote for Trudeau again are taking another look at their leaders. Aggressive retaliation. Freeland has put forward the most aggressive policy ideas in reaction to Trump, proposing For instance, that countries form a united front against the US and place 100% tariffs on vehicles made by Elon Musk's Tesla Inc. Carney described Trump's protectionism as a fever that has gripped our southern neighbor, and argued that Canada's best option is to retaliate against the US and seek out other trading partners. The Leger poll found that Carney is the preferred candidate among Liberal supporters, and that if he becomes Liberal leader, the party would enjoy about the same level of support as the Conservatives. I think there's an inflection point when you have Donald Trump actually present an existential threat to Canada, said Sabrina Grover, a Liberal strategist and senior advisor at North Star Public Affairs. In the face of that, Canadians are turning away from what has been an unserious time in Canadian politics. Led a lot by the conservative bumper sticker slogan approach. 51st state? Canadians aren't interested. A protracted trade war between Canada and the US would likely plunge Canada into a recession and cause hundreds of thousands of job losses. Leading economists say the Canadian economy will face its most severe shock since the COVID-19 pandemic and could fall into recession if the tariff war continues, with some calling it an existential threat. Trump's planned 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum, along with potential levies on cars and other items, would hurt key sectors in vote-rich Ontario and Quebec. President Donald Trump's 25% tariffs on most goods the United States buys from Canada and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's planned retaliation against $155 billion, $105 billion, worth of American-made products would reduce real gross domestic product growth by 2 to 4 percentage points. Economists estimate the threats from Washington have unleashed a wave of patriotism that Liberals argue runs contrary to Poilievre's earlier refrain that Canada is broken. You can't spend 2 years telling Canadians that Canada's broken and then all of a sudden decide that Canada's great and it's Canada first, Grover said. To Conservatives, however, Poilievre's messaging matches the moment. If the economy is the #1 issue, they say, their leader enjoys more credibility than anyone. Mark Carney is competitive against Conservatives. Poll finds, I think the question in the election is who is going to make life more affordable for Canadians, said Laura Kirkamaki, Vice President at Macmillan Vantage and former Principal Secretary to Aaron O'Toole, Poilievre's predecessor. I think that Pierre has always put Canada first and Canadians first in all of his policy ideas. Carney and Freeland have both used Trump as justification for ditching some unpopular Trudeau-era policies, the consumer carbon tax and a hike in the capital gains tax rate. Liberals are also publicly reconsidering ideas they've long resisted, such as building more pipelines to move crude west to east or to coastlines, to lessen Canada's reliance on the US as the main buyer of its oil. Conservatives scoff at the change in the Liberals' tone. It's honestly laughable at this point that they think anyone would believe they aren't going to bring in a carbon tax, and that they suddenly woke up and care about the oil and gas sector in this country. Kirkamaki said, Trudeau's departure and Trump's trade policy have catapulted other Canadian politicians into the spotlight. 2. Doug Ford, the Conservative Premier of Ontario, called a snap election for the end of February. He argued that he needs a fresh mandate for the government spending required to weather a trade war, which would hammer the province's automotive and manufacturing sectors. Ford has proposed a carrot-and-stick approach to Trump. In Washington, he once again pitched to American audiences what he called Fordham Can, a vague concept that calls for greater cooperation between the two countries in developing critical minerals and pushing back against Chinese imports. Canadian provincial and territorial leaders have filed tariffs objections in Washington, trying to send a message that they can help the new administration boost economic growth and compete with China. For the first time, all 13 of the country's prime ministers are in Washington to lobby Republican lawmakers against President Donald Trump's proposed import tariffs. He has brought that message to Fox News and other U.S. media outlets. He has also been a vocal supporter of tariff retaliation. After Trump's February executive order on broad tariffs, Ford said it would ban U.S. companies from participating in any government projects and canceled its contract with Musk's Starlink. He sometimes wears a MAGA-like blue baseball cap emblazoned with the words, "Canada is not for sale." Polls suggest his early election bet is likely to pay off, with some projections showing his party could sweep close to 100 of the 124 seats contested in the February 27 vote. Ford has really played this situation well and has come out positioning himself as a more mature statesman. rather than the more adolescent quips that we get from Pierre Poilievre, said Julie Simmons, a political science professor at the University of Guelph. But Poilievre's combative style may still resonate in Western Canada, where Ford's behavior could be seen as paternalistic. Doug Ford's presumption that he can speak on behalf of Canada is probably an irritant in a place like Alberta, she said. In the French-speaking province of Quebec, another game is playing out. The Parti Québécois, which seeks the province's independence from Canada, had been riding high in public opinion surveys, with an election due in 2026. But support for Quebec separation has fallen from 37% to 29% since November, the lowest in 5 years. According to Leger, Dallaire said Quebecers might start to view things differently now. If we complain that Canada's too small relative to the US and that's why we get bullied. Imagine if it's 9 million people against the American giant, he said, so it makes your arguments in favor of sovereignty all the more difficult to make in the current context.